All right, everyone. I'm Mike Sinisi. I'm the executive editor for Make Magazine. This is Brendan Schulman, the VP of Policy and Legal Affairs for DJI. We'll let, I think there's still a few people coming in, but we're going to have a nice conversation. We're talking about drones and things you can do with them. Both as an activity, but also in a legal capacity, because that's a very pressing question right now. So one of the things I want to start off with is, Brendan, you're the world's foremost leading expert in the world of drone regulation, especially in all capacities, but also really specifically looking at the consumer side. You recently left Kramer Levin and are now at DJI. Congratulations on that. That's very recent and very exciting. So what's going on? What's going on with this new role?
Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here. I was here last year speaking outside on similar topics. The new role is fascinating. So I went from being the head of my law firm's unmanned aircraft systems legal group just over the river in Manhattan to the VP of Policy and Legal Affairs for DJI, which I think some of you know is the leading brand of consumer and commercial drones around the world. And really the role is great because now I can take many of the same advocacy positions, the things that I think we needed to address as an industry and run with them. I can go out there and advocate for some things we'll talk about today, I think, like the micro rule, having a category for very small drones. I can work on things like what do we do about geofencing, really just the whole range of things that have come up in the policy and legal world, things like privacy and safety.
Great. You're based in DC right now, is that right?
I'm based in New York, but I spend a lot of time in DC.
I can imagine, yeah. So an overview of some of the history of drone regulation rules, et cetera. I know you were involved in a very early case with Trappy Perker. Real quickly, tell us, where have things been at? Let's say you go back in time up until just maybe 9 months ago.
Things are changing all the time in this field. It's really fascinating. I think if you go back even further, if you go back decades, you would find model aircraft, as we used to call them, model airplanes, being used mostly for recreation, but occasionally used for commercial purposes. If you remember that movie, The Aviators, with Leonardo DiCaprio, all of the special effects, all of the shots of airplanes flying across the harbor, the Spruce Goose, those were all done with very large-scale model aircraft that would basically take up the whole stage here. So we've had that kind of remote-controlled aircraft use, both recreational and commercial, for a long time. What's happened is in the past few years, the technology has improved. Everything's gotten smaller, more affordable, easy to use. You can now go get a Phantom for like $700, and you're up in the air in as long as it takes to charge the battery. And I think that has opened up a lot of really interesting possibilities for people to experiment, to adapt, modify the technology for various purposes. Where it goes legally is, we're still in a federal rulemaking process where the FAA has not finalized the rules for how the drones are supposed to be operated in the commercial context. With respect to recreational use, the FAA is still saying that there are no regulations concerning recreational use, but there are certain guidelines within which you should operate if you want to fall into the model aircraft category, namely that you're operating for recreational purposes, you're flying a sufficient distance away from airports, or you're notifying the airport that you're going to fly closer if you have a reason to fly closer. You stay below a certain altitude that it's considered safe.
Right. So one of the things I thought was great, South by Southwest, it's about 1.5 years ago, and it was right during the midst of the suit that you were defending Rafael Trappy about. Yeah. That morning, the announcement came out. They ruled in your favor, and it was sort of a landmark decision in the sense. My favorite part about it was a number of people showed up. We had a conversation there. A number of people showed up to thank you, because these were people who were doing aerial videography, photography, local people in the Texas community, and this was their livelihood. And one of them even had printed out the entire, it was the decision
itself,
and had you autograph it.
Yes. Which, by the way, is a completely bizarre experience. As a lawyer for 15 years, I've never had a fan. I don't think many lawyers have fans. I don't know. If you have your own lawyer, I don't think you, other than pay him or her, you probably don't thank him. So that was a remarkable experience. And yeah, look, I think the Perker case, regardless of the outcome, it always, from my point of view, always stood for the proposition that when you have a new technology with such enormous potential and so many people interested in using it for beneficial purposes, that you can't just regulate it in the old way. You can't just tell people, hey, stop using this technology for a business purpose. That may be an okay position for a government to have for a short period of time until they figure things out, but we're talking about 10 years of the FAA saying don't operate a model aircraft for a business purpose until we have the regulations. And here we are. It's a year later. We still don't have the final regulations. There was a proposal in February. So I think the response and all the thank yous were someone was finally trying to move the ball forward. Regardless of the context, Trappy, there are a lot of people who love him, a lot of people who don't. Regardless of what you think of that case, it was very useful at starting really a national, if not international, dialogue about where we should go with the technology, what regulation should apply to it.
Right. So February proposals were announced, and broadly speaking, what's the gist of what was announced? Where are we at right now?
So this is the FAA's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. I'll try to skip the legalese today because we're all here to have fun. I wore jeans. So
Crazy.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I never do that. So the FAA was supposed to and did issue a set of rules that are proposed to be implemented, I think, sometime next year. They're trying to get it done sooner, but realistically, probably not before the middle to end of next year will they be finalized. And that's largely to govern commercial operations of drones. They were receptive to and received comments. I think there were about 4,000 or 5,000 comments that were filed in response to that. Some of the good news, I think, from my point of view, is that there was no what's called an airworthiness certificate requirement, that your aircraft, to the extent that drones are considered aircraft, doesn't need to be certified by the FAA as being worthy of flight, which is a very expensive, time-consuming process that is used for passenger aircraft because people's lives are on board. So they are not proposing to have that requirement. With respect to pilot certification, which has been a big question for a long time, no particular expertise required. All you will need is an examination based on aeronautical knowledge. So knowing things about airports and airspace, and maybe a little bit about aerodynamics, how drones work, and pass the test, and you've got effectively your license to operate. Some of the negative parts, some of the concerns that I have about the proposal, there's no distinction, and this is of particular interest, I think, to this community, is that there's no distinction or no in-between category. You've got the commercial operating rules that are proposed, and then you've got model aircraft hobbyists, and nothing in between. There's nothing to address education, academics, R&D, someone tinkering in the garage and building something, thinking about a startup. Is that commercial? Is that recreational? Is it something in between? Right. There are also other exclusions, like you can't operate at night. So if you think about applications like search and rescue, where you want to use a thermal camera to try to find people who are missing, under the commercial rules, it's not going to be allowed, at least not at first. Limitation to visual line of sight, so you can't fly very far. All the companies that you hear about constantly in the papers that want to do package delivery are going to have a problem because there's nothing in the rule that permits delivery beyond visual line of sight. And if you're just delivering it as far as you can see, it's not particularly useful. So there's sort of a list of things that are of concern to me, but I think overall it's more progressive than I feared, and that's good news.
That's good. And this is where you have a micro proposal. What's that?
So the micro proposal actually is, I started advocating for it on behalf of a client when I was in private practice, and I believe in it strongly, and it's something that DJI also supports with my leadership. And this is in concept, the idea that we're going to have a different regulatory category for the very lightweight drones, the drones that weigh only 3 or 4 pounds, that we're going to treat them differently and say, look, this is an open category for innovation. If we issue a handful of easy-to-understand rules, like fly more than 5 miles from an airport, stay under 400 feet, keep it within visual line of sight, maybe a couple other things, that you should be able to operate that without a license, without having to register your drone as an aircraft, which, by the way, is in the NPRM, so you'd have to register, and that's a believe it or not, a carbon copy form system. You have to go to the airport, get the form from the FAA, fill it out in paper. It takes 3 weeks to register your drone or your aircraft. So that system will continue to apply, and what I'm saying is that for the micro category, for what effectively are toys or a little bit better things that can do useful commercial work, but that are so lightweight that they're safe, that we should have a different category. And I consider that a problem solver because of this philosophical question about what's recreational, what's commercial, what's academic, where do you put volunteer search and rescue, humanitarian, civic uses. You're doing some measurements for your city. Maybe they have nearby woods and they want someone to go and measure the trees. You're not being paid. Is that commercial? Is it a governmental operation? I think it does. I think if you've got a safe operation because your drone is small and you're keeping to some simple and easy to understand rules, you should be able to go out and do it without a permit and explore, build the technology, make something.
Right, right. And a lot of that obviously ties into what DJI is focused on because that's the exact category that you guys operate in.
Well, the Phantom would fit in that. The Phantom weighs 3 pounds, so it's certainly in that category. But
right.
There are a lot of companies that have drones in this category. And I think even if you create it, and it's not so much about where you put that weight limit. You know, we can move it up or down and talk about different parameters for it. But it's the concept that really matters. And yes, we have a product that would fit into it, but I was advocating for this before I worked at a company that had a product. The client I did it for was the UAS America Fund. They don't sell drones. They want to be in the business of funding other companies that want to create the technology. So it's not product specific, and I can think of at least half a dozen other competitors that have products that fit right into the category.
No, there are quite a few, and it's and they're all doing amazing things. But I think all of us here this would be something that would be of benefit to us. It's interesting with the location of Maker Faire here in New York at the New York Hall of Science, being so close to the airport. Right. This is a very strict no-fly location. We've got our tented areas with we got our drone zone. We have the Aerial Sports League doing drone racing today. Yep. But there's a no tolerance policy for any flight that's happening. They may even just kick you out of the grounds. Doesn't help that the Pope was just in town.
Yeah, the Pope. Yeah, the Pope, and we're also near the stadium. On game day, there's a TFR, temporary flight restriction, that comes into effect an hour before and an hour after the game. It's a 3-mile radius. So, one of the things that we are grappling with is DJI was the first company to implement what we call geofencing or no-fly zone technology into our consumer products. And I think that was a great initial effort to try to keep people from inadvertently flying in places that would raise concerns, particularly aviation safety concerns. But we have to do better because that static system is not the way the aviation world works. So when the Pope comes to town, it's a great example.
Right.
You've got a huge TFR. It was 20 miles around all 3 airports here. So if you looked at the FAA's map, it was basically the New York metro area was TFR'd out. So we're going to need a drone that responds to those changing conditions, and that also allows some flexibility, because if we are at this event and we're under the tent or the cage, we're not posing a hazard. You're going to want to be able to operate in locations where you have authorization, or if you have a dedicated model aircraft field that's been there for 20 years and the airport knows you're there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to fly. So the next generation of this technology will take into account both of those things, the changing environment and also the need for flexibility.
And I imagine something like that would have to be highly dynamic.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, how does that? Is there a conversation when those topics come up? Conversations about privacy, and someone might not want someone to know where they're flying. I mean, I'm imagining not for nefarious reasons, but just there's people that are very, very interested in privacy.
Yeah. So you're talking about the privacy of the drone pilot.
Sure.
Yeah. So the privacy, most often the privacy issues come up in terms of people who don't want to be photographed or who are concerned that they might be photographed by a drone in an inappropriate location. And that concern has obviously resulted in a number of headlines, and also at the state level some legislation that we can talk about. But on the flip side, I think you're absolutely correct. We should think about the privacy of the drone operator. A lot of lawmakers are talking about a licensing system, an ability to look up and know who's flying the drone that's over your head. We don't really have that in effect for airplanes or cars. Yes, there's a license plate, but to figure out who owns the car takes some effort, and even then you don't know who is driving, you just know who owns the car. So to go to a system where you could figure out who's flying every drone, I think does raise a privacy issue for the pilot. And if you're a company that's doing maybe some proprietary work, you're out in the farmland and you're doing some agriculture assessments, or you're scoping out a new wind farm, it might be very sensitive for someone to figure out that you're a big company that's doing some aerial work in a location.
Right, right. Or if in a commercial sense, you're doing some flying and someone decides, hey, this is a good moment to turn off the switch, the power switch on everybody, and they're going offline. Imagine as that connectivity comes up, that becomes something. I wouldn't want that on my car.
Right.
And I probably wouldn't want that while I'm flying. But at the same time, the trade-off is we also will benefit from having some of those controls as well to allow for things like pub visits.
Right. So I agree completely. There's certainly a benefit from developing technology that enables users, operators to know where they are, to make responsible decisions. But ultimately, just like when you drive a car, Ford Motor Company isn't stopping you from driving on the sidewalk, and usually you aren't on the sidewalk, but once in a while you have to park there. So there are situations where you might say, gee, we shouldn't be flying here except, and it's the exceptions that I think can often make the difference. So we've had reports of drones in wildfire locations in California. That was an issue over the summer. I went out to California to testify at a hearing in Sacramento on that. And one of the concerns there is if we geofence out the wildfire or emergency locations, the emergency responders won't have access to the technology. And when they're using it to help direct their response efforts, the firefighting, they won't have the functionality. So I don't want to have a situation where we've got great technology that can be used in beneficial ways, and we're turning things off because of a few people who are misusing it or who just inadvertently don't understand where and when they should be flying.
Right, right. And actually, it's something I've been wanting to ask you about, specifically the wildfires. It seems like it's been a really interesting summer with a lot of different reports of drones are keeping firefighters away from doing their jobs, and drones are having near misses with airplanes and so forth. How much of that is legitimate? How much of it is media sensationalism? What's really happening?
It's a legitimate concern, for sure. I am concerned about it personally. I have been for a while. I think the reporting has been inaccurate and unfair. I think if you talk about the wildfire situations, when I was out there a month ago testifying, there were 12 of them, but you'd think it was every day. But they had counted 12 situations where they decided to ground the planes because they saw a drone momentarily in the airspace and decided the whole firefighting effort had to be grounded. Whether that was an overreaction or precaution, I don't know. But things get reported out in ways that aren't really accurate. So for example, a commercial airline pilot saw a drone or reported a drone 12 miles from Newark Airport. Virtually every newspaper headline said drones at or drones near Newark Airport. And I don't think 12 miles is at or near the airport. Right. So I think what we need is better information. One of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, the AMA, they're sort of the hobbyist organization. They've been around for 80 years. They have a set of safety rules, very safety conscious. They looked at the FAA's report of the 700 drone sightings, which were originally characterized by the FAA as close calls on their very own website. And then about a month later, when they released the actual data, the FAA was calling them possible encounters. So we had a really, I think, important change of terminology. When the AMA looked at the reports, they found that only a very small fraction of them could fairly be called close calls or near misses. A lot of them were reports of people seeing the drones from the ground. They weren't even pilot reports. A lot of them were military aircraft, and probably a fair number were balloons or birds. Right. So I'm not trying to suggest that there isn't an issue that we have to deal with as an industry and as a company, but I think it's really important that we not let the headlines drive the legislation or policy, because we really don't have good data on how big the problem is and what the problem actually is. Is it that we have people flying too high? Is it an altitude issue? Because in some of these reports are 7,000 feet. Right. But when you have the 7,000-foot report out of Boston and the pilot says balloon or drone, but then the headline just says drone, we have a problem of information.
Absolutely. Yeah. 7,000 feet is insanely high. Yeah. I can't see my drone when it's 200 feet, even 50 feet sometimes. It's hard for me to imagine someone putting something that high in the air and just letting it fly around.
Well, DJI has a built-in altitude limitation, so there's a default of 120 meters, so about 398 feet. So out of the box, you're not going to fly above 400.
Right.
That can be changed because if you're flying up the side of a mountain, you're going to need to go above 400 feet from where you started. So there's some flexibility, but it's intentional. You have to put in the change to get higher altitude out of the box. So you're not going to have, I don't think you'd have an inadvertent flight at a high altitude with one of our products today. So either it's intentional or it's someone is seeing something else or it's a different product. Could be a bird, could be a weather balloon. We have lots of weather balloons that get launched every day in the country. No one really tracks those things. No. It could be a bird. There was a report someone told me about in Hawaii. A helicopter pilot saw what they thought was a drone. They circled back for a second look, and it was an albatross. If you look at the back of an albatross, it has a white X pattern to it. And do you know any drones that look like a white X?
I can think of one or two. Yeah.
There are a few outside. So
Right.
from a distance, particularly when all the headlines are saying drones are everywhere, you start to see things that you expect to see, even if they aren't what they are.
Yeah. There was a recent case. It was in Illinois, another near miss, or actually it was a strike. It was a reported possible drone strike that happened on a small Piper single pilot airplane.
Right.
And we wrote a piece about it on Make about sort of the, was it a drone? And it was really focused on let's not jump into these things without having the information. Notes in there that the pilot actually never saw a drone.
Right.
He said, I hit something, it might have been a drone. I think it was a drone. And he was flying at something, something around 7,000 feet as well. I forget the exact altitude. It was considerably high. But they did serious. I mean, they take this stuff serious. They did biological research to find out what caused the impact or what material is on that impact, and it was a bird.
It was, and I've got some connections. The behind-the-scenes story that I can talk about is that initially, yes, it was reported out as the first collision between a drone and an aircraft. If you look at the pictures, there's a gash in the wing boot. So it looks pretty bad. It looks like something hard hit the wing. There's no blood or feathers visible, so you think, what else could it be? And the pilot's saying, I didn't see it, but it must be a drone. And of course, the media reports it out as a drone, without knowing I mean, usually with aircraft incidents, you always want to wait for the investigation. So because of that elevated attention to that particular case, even though there was no injury or serious damage, it got looked at a little bit more carefully than it otherwise would have. And it's a good thing, because what happened is the wing section was sent to the Smithsonian in Washington. They do bird strike examinations to try to figure out what type of bird hit the plane so they can sort of count the wildlife strikes and try to mitigate that hazard near airports and other locations. And they found remains of bird feathers inside the crack of the wing. So had there not been the attention, number one, there wouldn't have been those alarmist headlines about the drone mid-air collision, but number two, we also wouldn't have gotten the truth, which is that was a bird strike. The problem is that it's kind of too late, because everyone reported that, not everyone, but a lot of people reported that out as a drone collision, and it wasn't. And without waiting for that information, unfortunately, we have a very bad PR vibe going on right now. And the technology is amazing, and I think going to save lives, not put lives in danger. And the problem is we've got a lot of policymakers in Washington and at the state level that are seeing those headlines and feel that we need to do something because of this enormous hazard out there. And I don't think it's an enormous hazard. It is a concern, but not an enormous hazard.
What about the local and state level? What type of things are happening there?
So mostly in response to privacy concerns, we've seen probably up to about 25 or so states that have enacted some kind of drone-related legislation. It's mostly focused on law enforcement agencies, requiring warrants for law enforcement to use a drone to take aerial photographs, or in some cases, an outright moratorium on public agency use. Virginia had that for about 2 years. No agency can use a drone, period. In more cases now, we're seeing legislation directed towards civilian, private, commercial use. So a recent good example is in California. There was a bill proposed in the Senate. It passed through the Senate as a privacy bill. It would have given people a right to sue someone who is taking an invasive photograph of a private or familial act in a way that's offensive. Basically sort of a paparazzi type bill. So if you take an invasive private photograph in California, the person you're taking the photograph of could sue you. Similarly, that was going to be applied to drones, and that seems pretty much reasonable. It's just, you're not singling out the technology, you're just bringing it into the existing balanced framework for privacy torts, privacy violations. At the last minute, the last hearing in the Assembly, that bill was changed to be one of unlawful occupation of real estate. So all of a sudden, if you were flying at 349 feet above private property without permission, you would be subject to a lawsuit, even if you don't have a camera on board, you didn't take a photograph, no one was home, no privacy, no harm, but the statute for unlawful occupation of real estate in California provides that you can get as damages the value of the unlawful occupation. So it's kind of like I sold lemonade on your front lawn, you weren't even home, you weren't harmed, but I got some benefit from your land, and now you can sue me for the benefit. So that was going to apply to all drone flights under 350 feet. And we and the rest of the industry thought, that's just not the right way to address privacy concern. In fact, doesn't address privacy concern at all, and would just lead to vexatious litigation, sort of contingency fee strike suits against people who are innovating, people who are experimenting with the technology, and so we opposed it, and really everyone in the industry did, and thankfully we were able to advocate for and achieve a veto by Governor Brown. But it was very, very close, because all the way along it had received support in the Senate and the Assembly until that last minute, very subtle change.
I think was it Oklahoma that was one of the states that kind of early on started allowing, on the state level, for agricultural use of drones. But they also, and I might be wrong on this, but I feel like they had a sort of a bipolar, similar rule that was being proposed, which was to also allow people to shoot down drones.
I don't remember I may be the expert, but every state it's tough. Oklahoma. I mean, there have been various proposals to allow people to shoot down drones, and people ask me that once in a while. The furthest it's gone, and there's a bill right now on the governor's desk in California to allow to allow fire responders to be immune from lawsuits if they disable or damage a drone to protect their firefighting area, and that's something we support. That sounds fine to me. You shouldn't be able to sue the firefighter who has to take down the drone so that that person can do his or her job. With respect to shooting things down, it's really interesting. There is a federal statute that makes it a crime to destroy an aircraft. So if you believe that these are aircraft, as many regulators and other people do, then it is already a federal crime to shoot down a drone. And those guys who are out in the cage destroying drones for fun with the combat, which I've done personally, are they committing a crime with every flight? I don't think so. I don't think that law was supposed to address this It's another great example of technology and law. What are we doing here?
Right.
So shooting down drones doesn't seem like a federal offense the way that it would be if there was somebody on board. So then there's the question of what do you do if something's really in your way, bothering you? And I think the answer to that always is talk to the authorities. You don't want to take the law into your own hands. You don't want to start shooting things down. I don't remember the Oklahoma proposal, but I think if it goes in that direction, it's just open. Yeah, the bullet is traveling, and if you miss, where's it going to land? So why would you ever want someone to shoot down a drone? I don't know, unless you're in the cage.
They love shooting guns in Oklahoma.
Well, maybe.
It's part of it, I think. So who with the proposals, with the way things are set up right now, who's actually doing what with drones? Like, who's allowed to do what? What's actually happening right now?
It's a really great moment in the history of what I think is the new era of aviation. If you go back and think of like the early 90s, maybe the late 80s, the internet, things were just getting started. I don't think anybody would have thought, gee, we're going to have this internet in our pockets. It's going to connect us socially around the world, tweeting, and I've got a Twitter account. It's changed people's lives, in some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse. The question is, how can you regulate these downstream developments at the beginning? I don't think you can. If you try to figure out all the problems the internet would pose back in the 90s, you never would have done it right, and you would have stifled the innovation. So what I see people doing, just amazing applications. We have an SDK, so you can develop on the DJI platform. At the booth, you can go see the Matrice 100, which is our developer platform. It has these bays you can slide hardware into. It takes 2 batteries, so you get 40 minutes flight time. It's got what we call guidance, which is basically sense and avoid anti-collision technology. So if you fly it against the wall, it will actually stop itself. So the development is really rapid. I mean, these are all things that have just been developed in the past like 2 years.
Right.
When I started in this field, I mean, I've been doing RC airplanes for over 20 years, but just what's happened in the past 2 to 3 years is amazing. And so I'm glad to see that the regulations aren't quite getting completely in the way of innovation, because had everyone followed FAA regulations for aircraft, so that you would need experimental certificates and to go get a certificated pilot to fly the drone, none of this stuff would exist, or at least it wouldn't exist in this country. It would have to be developed somewhere else. And I think that would be a loss both to industry and also to the makers who are developing great stuff. We've seen people who are putting VR goggles well, not on the drone, but connecting them to the drone. Right. So you take the Inspire up and you've got that 360 camera with the gear up. You put on the goggles and suddenly you can look around and see the world from that bird's eye point of view. Right. And there's another company that's doing that's got a ring controller. So instead of using the sticks to control the drone, you've got a ring and you just sort of move your hand like this and the drone follows your movement. So we're seeing a lot of the wearable technology, Internet of Things type developments merging with the drone technology, and it's really an amazing time to see that. And then on the applications and the end user side, one way to measure what people are doing is to look at the FAA Section 333 exemptions. That's the FAA's permit process for their approval of a commercial operation. They've got about 1,500 of those issued over the past year. And most of the people who are at least going that route are doing aerial photography, cinematography. I think the next biggest category is data acquisition for infrastructure, like inspecting pipelines, power lines, factories, things like that. And then you've got sort of the runner-up categories right now, which is things like agriculture, real estate, and other kinds of applications. But every week I hear about something else.
One of the things I loved was at Interdrone a couple weeks ago. I saw you there in Vegas. It's the first big trade show. There's a few of them, but this was it was a great show in Las Vegas. But FLIR was there with the FLIR View Pro. This is FLIR makes these thermal imaging infrared cameras. People have figured out how to hack and mount them to their quadcopters, but they've realized this is a segment that is growing, and it's growing quickly. And they came out with a camera that has the same mount as the GoPro camera with connectivity that allows you to control it, and similarly as the GoPros can. And that starts to open up. It's more expensive than what I'd probably buy my son for a birthday present. I think it starts at about $2,000. Okay. But that's super affordable in the world of when you're doing search and rescue, when you're doing agriculture inspection, and then you can create 3D models of aerial landscapes. Mm-hmm. We're at a point where the technology is getting absolutely amazing, and almost we have to realize how far ahead of us it is, and have to think of around what are the things that we can do with this technology. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's great. That was a great show. They're I think the biggest to date drone expo of its kind. I mean, there are a lot of them these days. We debuted our X5 camera there. That's a micro Four Thirds camera, the first aerial. I mean, you can take a micro Four Thirds camera and try to get it on a drone and hook it up and all that, but then you're lifting probably 25 pounds to get all that in the air. So the X5 just mounts on the Inspire. You swap out the X3, the existing camera, put in the X5, and now you've got a micro Four Thirds camera in the air with incredible dynamic range. So, and we're the FLIR stuff is great to see for the reason you say. I think search and rescue or other multispectral camera applications like agriculture are really going to benefit from the rapid innovation.
There's a video. This is actually from a couple years back, but it's a Canadian video. The Canadian Royal Mounted Police had an incident that happened. I think it was Manitoba, somewhere in the center north of Canada, far, far, far away from anybody, anything. It's middle of the winter, and it was a guy who crashed his car in the middle of the night. Called the town, one town over, which was already like 12 miles out, and he was kind of in a daze and said, "I crashed my car. I don't really know where I am or who I am or anything." And then the phone just went dead. Yeah. And so they went out to try to find this guy. I don't know if you saw it. There's a great video for this. I imagine you must have. But they sent out a search and rescue team to find this guy. They found his car. They found some footprints in the middle of the night out into the snow, that's just out into the wilderness and into these fields. And they couldn't track the guy. They couldn't find him. They got another phone call from him, triangulated a little bit that he was 2 kilometers further away at this point. And it's, you know, time's ticking. I think a couple hours had passed at this point. They've been looking all over for him.
And it's winter and it's really cold.
Yeah, it is. Let's not forget that. It might have. I don't know if it was January 1st. It was the dead of winter.
Yep.
One of the forensics team members said, "I've got one of these things in the trunk of my car," and he had, I guess he was using a slightly bigger rig for some professional work. Canada's a little bit more. They're a little more advanced with some of the stuff than what we've been permitted to do so far. Mm-hmm. But he had the thermal camera on his setup, and so he said, "I'm going to see what I can do with this," and he lifted it off. And the video is great because he's captured all this video, and he comes searching around with this from a pretty good perspective point, and really quickly spots the heat signature of the guy that they're looking for, and he's curled up in a ball. They hike out to where he is. They find the guy. He's curled up in a ball at the base of a tree in the snow along a ridge of trees, a location that there was absolutely no way they would have been able to find this guy that night. They would have had to comb the area once the sun came up hours later, and you know that wouldn't have turned out well. Not if you waited that long. Yeah, the guy was alive. They saved him. It was great. It's an amazing moment.
So there's no doubt in my mind that this technology is going to save lives. For all the headlines we have about aviation risk and you know, occasionally we now see instances of people getting hurt who happen to be near drones when there's an incident. No question in my mind that we're going to save lives. There are probably about 20 deaths a year attributed to people climbing cell phone towers to do inspections or taking pictures, and they fall off. So you can do the same thing with a drone.
Right.
Same thing with power lines. Search and rescue, one of my favorite applications. When I was in private practice, I advocated on behalf of Texas EquiSearch. So right. And that's also in Texas. So they're out there. They've done this for, believe it or not, now 11 years or more, since, like 2004, using a fixed-wing drone, we used to call them model aircraft, but all right, drone, with a camera, point-and-shoot camera, flying patterns across fields where people have gone missing, and actually finding them. In many cases, it's remains, but in other cases, there was one instance where they found 2 missing girls alive, and that was like years and years ago. So imagine now that this stuff is easier to use, it's cheaper, we've got thermal cameras coming, we've got higher resolution, we've got the ability to take dangerous jobs and replace the existing method with a drone. It's really going to revolutionize maybe half of the industries out there that have things to do outside. And that's why it's really important that we get the regulatory stuff right, because if you think about that, I mean, that was the RCMP, that was a police operation. Right. But if that were a bystander with a drone who's in a position to find somebody and has to think, gee, am I going to get in trouble? Do I have the right permit? Am I authorized? That's a life that's put in danger because of a regulatory framework. So I think we need flexibility. I come back to the micro category. The need to address the sort of the in-between category. It's not quite recreational, it's not quite commercial, it's civic, it's something else, it's creative, it's a startup, it's R&D, education. There's got to be some ability to use this technology as the tool that it is at low altitudes. And I think that's really important. And also an important reason why when you see the state legislation or the local legislation gearing up, that it's important to respond as a community. We can be helpful at trying to respond to what's going on in your areas. New York does not currently have an active bill that I know of, but it wouldn't surprise me if something were proposed soon because of all of the incidents that tend to happen around here. The U.S. Open, which was not our product, finally. But things like that, they raise concerns and then they get elevated to the lawmaking level. And then what you don't get in the same article or the same headline is, but wait, there are all these life-saving applications that we can already do today and we're doing. We just put out one of our DJI stories. We do this DJI stories series, and we did a search and rescue story just, I think, a week ago. It came out. Check our channel. You'll see it on YouTube, where someone took an Inspire, tied a line to it. This is a volunteer who was in the floods in Texas.
Texas?
Yep, Texas. They tied the line. They flew out to a house. These 2 people were stuck in their house with raging water on both sides. and they were able to send the lifeboat to rescue those people. So life-saving applications are already here, and we need to protect those.
It's great. So it looks like we're wrapping up on time. You've got some obligations, but we can, if you've got a couple minutes, we can step out into the hallway if anyone has questions.
Happy to.
And then run off to what you need to do. But thank you, everyone, for sitting in, letting us chat with you. And thank you, Brendan. Appreciate it. And thanks for all the great work you've been doing.
Appreciate it. Thank you.